Welcome back to the Stories of Northern Life podcast, brought to you by the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the English-only resolution that sparked the French language crisis in the Sault. We will be discussing topics that can be difficult for some listeners, as the wounds from this resolution can still be felt by the community. In June 2024, we had an exhibit on the French language and the Sault's Francophone history. To kick off the exhibit, we had a discussion panel that brought in Francophones to discuss their long history in this region and their experience in the community during the language crisis. We also had Dr. Michael Graydon from Algoma University to discuss his paper titled, "How Could This Happen to Us? French Community and Sault Ste. Marie's English Resolution." This is the main source I have used for today's episode. I recorded the discussion panel, and as I'm not the best editor, especially for videos, it has taken me a while to get it done. But I can finally say it's uploaded. This podcast episode goes with that video, so the video will be linked in the show notes today, or you can find it on our YouTube channel. Just search Sault Museum. Now, before we get into looking at the English-only resolution, let's have a bit of context first. So the Francophones were the first Europeans here, with the arrival of Etienne Brulé in 1618 and 1622. Then we have the Jesuits establishing a permanent mission in 1668. In 1671, the area was claimed for New France in the Pagina Saint-Luçon. Later, in 1742, Jean-Baptiste Cadot settled in the area and became the first farmer in the Sault. In 1751, Louis le Grandeur Seigneur Chevalier de Repentier built a fort and farm for the voyageurs of the fur trade to have a place to rest before continuing their journey. Jean Cadot managed the farm. Even after 1763, when New France was ceded to the British and the Sault was now in the hands of the English, the Francophones stayed. Jean Cadot stayed and became part of the fur trade in the area when the Northwest Company established their fur trading post in 1783. As the posts grew and more workers arrived, a community began to grow in the area. Most of the employees of the fur trading post were Francophones and Métis. They lived in a neighborhood next to the post. This area became known as Frenchtown. The city continued to grow, as did the community. And in 1902, they opened St. Ignatius Parish. A year later, they opened St. Ignace School next to the church. They were finally able to have their own French school and church. These were located in the West End at the corner of Cathcart and Huron Streets. In 1955, St. Ignatius was rebuilt, and it included a larger community space in the basement for meetings and events. You can hear in the video of the Francophone discussion panel the people talking about the St. Ignatius Church and its community center, and about how the community was built around the St. Ignatius Parish and how it was a center for events and celebrations. Another French church was built in 1965 in the east end of the city for Francophones on the other side of town. This was St. Croix. You can also hear it mentioned in the video. More French schools continued to open and close over the years. In 1964, we had Saint Jean d'Arc. In 1966, there was Notre Dame des Écoles. In 1969, we had Cardinal Léger open. In 1978, Sainte Marguerite replaced Saint Ignace. And in 1988, Notre Dame des Grands Lacs opened, which was the first French high school. So there is a quick overview of the community up to 1989, just before the English only resolution. So the resolution passed during a period of intense anti Quebec sentiment and resistance to bilingualism in Ontario. This was really spreading throughout the whole country. In or out of Nova Scotia and spreading throughout Canada, we had the Alliance for the Protection of English Canada, or APEC. It was formed in response to Quebec's Bill 101, and they began a campaign of fear mongering and anti French sentiment in response to Bill 8. One of APEC's members, Heller, was spewing things like social equality between people who speak different languages was only possible through the use of one language. Obviously, they didn't look up the definition of equality. Their name seems pretty fitting, as it is similar to a famous dictator that also believed in ethnic purity. The people who were anti French, trying to promote their hatred, began to refer to French Canadians as a different race. They were fear mongering and saying that they would take over Canada. They targeted people who felt slighted and said that it was all the fault of the French. Whether they couldn't get a job or couldn't advance in their career, they blamed the French and gained people to their side. Bill 8 was the French Languages Service Act, and it passed unanimously in 1986. The act guaranteed Francophone services in French at the provincial level, so in any provincial head office. It has since had new resolutions that provide more rights to access to French services in Ontario. The initial act brought the main change that was the catalyst for the English only resolution, which was just saying that French services would now sort of be mandatory in those provincial offices. Richard Pearman formed the Sault Ste. Marie Association for the Preservation of the English Language Rights, or SAPLER. He held public meetings espousing hatred, saying that they were protecting against the continual erosion of the use of English. He was influenced and also had ties to APEC, and he and a lot of others were influenced by Jack Andrew, author and racist, who wrote a book titled Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, Trudeau's Master Plan and How It Can Be Stopped. It became a Canadian bestseller and had a follow-up book titled Enough! Enough French, Enough Quebec. He was the main driver for many as his hatred was so public. He began to turn the issue into a race issue, so it drove more fear and hatred, drawing more people to his side. Bill 8 was put forth as an economic issue, so they could hide their vitriol towards the French and disguise it as an economic issue and trick people into supporting them. Sapler put newsletters out to the public saying that the special education, so any French teaching, was extremely detrimental to our English speaking schools and costing untold millions. At the same time this was going on, a lot of tension was brewing in the community over French education. The French schools were looking to limit the students who could attend their schools and to those who had one parent who was French or whose mother tongue was French. Schools were becoming watered down with Anglophone students, as they put it, who were there to learn French, and thus the Francophone students were suffering as the schools were not aimed at those who were seeking to maintain or improve their French. With this, many Francophones left the Catholic board and moved to the public and sought French education there. tensions were brewing on both the Anglophone side and the Francophone side, and even within the Francophone community itself. Um, Many people saw that the improvements for French education was justified, as they wanted to um, improve French and really help um, the Francophones keep their French and improve it, but that it was done in such a way that was insulting to the Anglophone community, and it drove a wedge. There were four French schools at the time, and they um, expressed, um, or many people in the community expressed, they didn't want it to be reduced to one that was segregated from the rest of the community. Cost was also brought up in this fight, as with everything, money can be a powerful tool to use to manipulate the narrative and make people react as you begin to argue that it would cost too much money. In September 1989, Sapler launched a petition going door to door, misleading people and getting them to sign a petition they didn't know what it really meant or said. They wanted a resolution to oppose Bill 8 and the French language. The next player we have is Mayor Fratesi. He was actually taking French classes before all this began, so he could better equip himself to become a provincial judge. Everybody sort of knew his grand ambitions, and while he was in office, he even wrote to the Ontario Attorney General to ask for a judge's seat, but there was no openings at the time. Finally, one did open up in 1989, but it was a designated bilingual seat, and thus he wasn't qualified. This infuriated Fratesi and started him on his anti-French quest. He already hated the fact that some jobs required you to be bilingual, so this was kind of like his breaking point. So when Sapler put the resolution before him, he was all too happy to accept it, and he even improved the wording before presenting it to council, so it was a little bit more palatable and sounded a little bit less racist. He claimed that the resolution was not anti-French, but that it was to protect the economy of the Sioux. Fratesi said Bill 8 would require the city to provide costly French services. He wanted to also use the resolution to signal his displeasure to the province and get their attention, but it only ended up hurting him and costing him any judge seat going forward. Groups like Sapler and APEC and the other people like them believe that Canada should be English only, and everyone in Canada should become, quote, Canadian and only speak English. Their goal was for everybody to assimilate to their ideal image. The resolution was officially presented to Council in January 1990, and the Francophone community had little warning. They did not have enough time to prepare to go before Council and speak out against it. The Council chamber was, however, full of Sapler supporters. The meeting was recorded, and we can see what was actually happening as the resolution was presented. Only one councillor appeared to speak out against the resolution, saying it could be interpreted as divisive, and it also solved a problem that didn't really exist. The resolution would state that the Sioux would become an English only city, that its operating language would be English. Well, it was already a fact that the operating language was English, so it was sort of redundant to state that in a resolution, but it was kind of an indirect manner to show the resentment toward the French. The resolution passed 11 to 2 and was also met with thundering applause. After that, people inside and outside the community began to criticize the city and their actions, in particular Fratesi. The Sioux Star wrote, "Whatever other claim to fame Joe Fratesi may make, he gave this city the worst black eyes in its history." The Globe and Mail wrote, "The resolution's intent was to tell the Francophone minority to mind its lowly place in the scheme of things." Fratesi kept saying the motives were financial, but nowhere was it ever stated that municipalities would be required to pay for the impacts of Bill 8. It was complete lies. By by March 1990, as the media began to investigate groups like Sapler and APEC, they found links between them and right-wing groups that were known for their anti-Semitic views, Holocaust denials, anti-immigrant and anti-foreign views, and also even ties to the KKK. When this happened, Pierman denied any formal links between Sapler and APEC, who had closer ties to these groups. After the resolution passed, the French community was left stunned, and many people who had signed the Sapler petition now realized what it actually was that they signed and were appalled. They not only felt attacked by this resolution, but were attacked by other members of the community. If you watch the video of the panel discussion, you can hear the testimony from Francophones who were harassed if they were heard speaking French in public. They had their houses vandalized, and some even received death threats towards their children. And so many Francophones decided to leave the city because they felt the community had forsaken them, and they sought a home somewhere more welcoming. It was a difficult time. After the resolution passed, people began to demonstrate in front of City Hall, urging them to reconsider. Council finally agreed to hold a special meeting to hear the Francophone concerns. With the protest from citizens and the portrayals in the media of Fratesian Council as racists and bigots, they passed a second resolution on February 19th, 1990, that read, "The Sioux very proudly recognizes the important role which French Canadians have played in our community and our country over the past 4 centuries." But it didn't actually address the former resolution and its effects. So, although it was a nice statement, it did nothing to improve what was going on. The city continued to refuse to make amends, and thus many groups decided not to visit or bring their business to the Sioux, such as 3 Francophone educator conventions that were relocated. And it was also said that the Ministry of Natural Resources chose not to move their offices here to the Sioux, so we lost roughly 300 to 400 permanent jobs. Finally, in 1996, for other reasons, Fratesi was forced to resign, and Mayor Steve Butland was elected. In 1999, Council formally rescinded the 1990 resolution unanimously. But an apology would not come until 10 years later with Mayor John Roswell. In 2010, he made the apology on local French public TV, but not a lot of people were able to view this at the time. The biggest amends, however, came this year in January 2024, 34 years after the English-only resolution was passed. Mayor Matthew Shoemaker passed a resolution, both in English and in French, that said the city would provide French services for its citizens. He remarked how a grave slight had been done to the community at the hands of the city with a 1990 resolution, and he hoped this new resolution was a way to rebuild the relationship and heal old wounds. But sadly, right after Shoemaker would do this, Fratesi would go on the news and say how this resolution was pointless and a waste of time and not needed at all. But in him doing so, it proved exactly how necessary this resolution was, as there are still wounds and still a huge divide between the city and the Francophone community. When I began to look into hosting the discussion panel, I was met with some resistance from the Francophone community. For the older generation that lived through it, the wounds are still very raw, and they wish to simply bury things and never talk about it. But that's not how we heal, and many people don't really know what happened. So I wanted to host this panel in English so that it could be shared with non-Francophones who either didn't know the whole story or who weren't here when it happened, so don't know anything about it. And thus, they also don't really know why our French community is so hidden, how after the resolution passed, the French community kind of went into hiding. With working at the museum, and even when I was at the Old Stone House, I would have many visitors come and ask me why our city does not have bilingual signs or information, as we have a very French name. And when I tell them what happened, they're shocked. But even before sort of all this, I knew that something had happened, but I didn't know exactly about the English only resolution. So when I would try to ask about it, I was met with resistance. So I just stopped asking. But now, as the museum is pushing forward our Francophone history collection project and trying to increase our records on the Francophone history in our community, it's time to speak on the English only resolution and the French language crisis it caused. So, that is our episode for today. There is still so much more to say. So go and watch the video on the Francophone history discussion panel linked below, that is on our YouTube page. You can also read Dr. Graydon's article, which is free to download, and it is also linked below. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks for listening. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might like our blog too. Head over to our website, Sault Museum, that's SAULT museum.ca, and look under Discover. You will find our blog, Museum Musings. We share short synopsis of influential people, historic places, and impactful events in our history. Pictures are always included, and you will be sure to learn a little something new with each post.
Hi, I'm J.L. Fizzell, and I write and publish poetry inspired by nature and the art of being human. These are some of my words. Maybe it's my inner artist, but I feel like one of the things I've always done in the forest is look for faces in the rocks, in the trees, and not really look for them, they just kind of jumped out at me. And I always found that really fascinating. So this poem is about that, and it's from my fourth book, Human Nature, and you'll find it in the summer chapter. It's called Faces in the Rocks. Faces in the rocks as we speed down the highway, a frozen family of ancients keeping watch, stern, strong, statuesque. This is my family. This is why nature feels like home. hope this poem took you somewhere inside yourself that you needed to go. You can listen to my story here on the Stories of Northern Life podcast. Links are in the show notes.